Welcome, everyone, this evening to this lecture. My name's Tom Gleason. I'm on the Programs Committee along with Nadine Shepard. Modern Beyond Style and the Pursuit of Beauty, the book that we're going to be discussing tonight with Jay and Larry, chronicles the career of architect Larry Booth, whose work parallels and in many ways has led to the development of the modern architecture for more than 50 years. Beginning when mid-century modernism was distrustful of tradition, Larry was one of the few architects in Chicago to show that the best architecture involves many influences, including historical ones. As a member of the Chicago Seven, a group of dissident avant-garde architects in the 1970s, he showed how the architectural past could and should be part of the modern. Over a long career, Larry has practiced his distinct architecture by synthesizing up-to-date construction techniques, including sustainable ones, with designs that invoke, for example, Mies van der Rohe, and in some ways and aspects, Palladios. Because of the blend of modernity and tradition requires substantial reserves of creativity, Larry has been involved in continually researching ways to maximize innovation with architectural grace. He believes today, as he believed when he began his practice, that beauty is the highest standard of architectural excellence, and that it remains as simple to witness as it is a challenge to achieve that. Larry Booth is currently the principal of Booth Hansen Architects. And then also here with us this evening discussing with Larry the book and the career is the author of the book, Jay Pridmore. Jay is a journalist and architectural writer who has published many books on the architecture of Chicago and Boston, Shanghai, and other places as well. One of his recent monographs was of the architecture of Ike Coburn of Lake Forest, who designed remarkable mid-century houses here and all over the country as well. Jay also writes biographies, some of historical figures, others for acquaintances whose lives have been interesting, and he chronicles those for the benefit of their grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and other generations of the family. So I'll pass this over. They're going to have a discussion here with some slides, and then at the end, if there were some questions for either one of them. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. We are very pleased to be here. We want to make this a conversation between Larry and me and with the rest of you, so that if you have a question for us, you might interrupt. Now, it has to be a good question, because he's going to get a lot of bad ones from me. So, the book is really a recitation of Larry's career in architecture, and it's entitled Modern Beyond Style, as you can see. And the title is significant because it recognizes the fact that modern architecture, and this is in Larry's view, should not be dependent upon any style. You know, what are the styles? International style, postmodern style, deconstructionist style. Style is something that Larry has always avoided, and we'll see that he avoids style like the plague. So for the other part of the title, what does modern mean? Modern means innovative architecture, and the point is that style as such is not innovative. It's a template. It's a shortcut. Style, as we say, style is for losers. Okay, yeah. Yeah, whose was it? So we find that achieving truly modern architecture is a matter of finding unique, original solutions to every design, and that's what Larry has been doing for really all of his career. The book is the result of his thinking, his quest for truly modern, truly innovative architecture, and it chronicles his experience from the time he was a young architect, a sole practitioner, essentially, to now, where he is the head of a large Chicago firm. So, Larry, maybe you could tell us a little bit about how the book came about, the advent of it, and, well, how long we've been working on it, in fact.
The first thing I have to do is thank Jay, because without his patience and his perseverance, we would never have gotten through this. Because the book started with a question, and it was about 4 or 5 years ago. at least. So what is Booth Hansen's architecture? It's kind of, people refer to it as the elevator speech. When somebody's in an elevator with you and they say, well, what kind of architecture do you do? What do you say? So the book was trying to answer that question. And it led to a whole variety of conversations and writing by Jay, and rewriting by Jay, and rewriting more by Jay, and rewriting more by Jay while he tried to understand what was at the start very inarticulate, because architecture is not a verbal art. It's a working of drawing and building models and talking to people.
Yeah, it's very non-linear too. You know,
And it's non-linear.
writing is a linear exercise, and architecture is anything but linear.
Right.
I wonder if we'd like to start with your background and training, which I think is really interesting. Could you tell us a little bit about your undergraduate years at Stanford and then your brief stop at Harvard, where you didn't get kicked out, you kicked them out, okay, and then to MIT, where you got your professional degree.
I grew up in LaGrange, not particularly alert to architecture, but my parents built a house when I was in 8th grade. And in watching that process, I was intrigued by it. And I was more captivated by the smell of fresh wood. So when it was time to go to college, and you had to answer what is it you'd like to be, I said, well, architecture, huh? Not knowing what it was or what it involved or anything other than what my experience had been with my parents' house. And I always wanted to go to California or out west because there are no mountains in Illinois and it gets cold. When I saw the catalog for Stanford, on the cover was a palm tree. I said, wow, I want to go there. So fortunately, at the time, you could get in. And so I had the architecture program at Stanford was like a liberal arts program. It wasn't an accredited professional program. It was more of an art and engineering program that was run and staffed by practicing architects in San Francisco for the main part. And those people were really talented and they were really a lot of fun. And we had great times. So then when it came time with graduation, okay, if you're going to be an architect, you've got to go to a real school. So again, I was fortunate enough to get into the Harvard Graduate School of Design. And when I got there, not knowing exactly what it was all about, I was kind of shocked, I guess I'd call it. They were teaching a curriculum of the Bauhaus. So one of the first projects we had was a small house, and there were 43 people in my class. And there were 42 houses that were square and with flat roofs. And I had a pitched roof, which, for some strange reason, it really undid the faculty. So I was called in for a conference. And they said, well, why don't you get with the program? And being, I don't know, naive, I said, okay, I get it. Flat roofs, you're supposed to do flat roofs. I said, why is a pitched roof not as good as a flat roof. And they thought I was a wise ass. And maybe I was. But, so I'd read a book by Albert Bush Brown, who happened to be on the faculty at MIT. So I went down, I called him up and I explained to him the situation. They came here and they seem to be pretty doctrinaire. And I don't get that. I just don't get that. And so he said, well, come and see me. So we had a great conversation for about an hour and a half. And at the end of that, he said, why don't you just come here? And that's how I got into MIT, through the back door. And then along with that education, which was great, there was Kenzo Tangi was our studio teacher the first semester there, and he was probably the most famous architect in Japan. He did the Tokyo City Hall, he did the Olympic Stadium for the Olympics in '58 or so, and he was a terrific guy. So I really enjoyed that. And then I went into the Army and was assigned to Munich, Germany. When I got to Munich, Germany, I looked at all these Baroque churches. The German Baroque churches are really amazing. And I realized that all I had been fed was that Baroque architecture was sick. And Rococo was sicker. So at that time, this was in the early 60s, architects were pretty doctrinaire about modernism. They had this crusade that they were on. And when I looked at these little churches that were just marvelous, I said, well, they were on the wrong side of the argument, for sure. Then I was able to stay in Europe and with my wife and our first son travel for 6 months with a Volkswagen bus, and we saw everything you're supposed to see. And I'd always been interested in Renaissance architecture, so I got to see all the Palladian villas, walk through a few of them, and those were probably the key to my education, with the exception of one class I took at Stanford my senior year, which was I looked on the catalog and there was a course called creativity. I said, well, it was in the engineering department. So I said, I'll take that course. So to give you an idea of what kind of course it was a seminar course. We sat around a table, about 12 or 15 people, students, and John Arnold was the teacher, and he was a really marvelous man. And to give you an idea, we talked about how people came up with ideas. And I'd never had a class like that. How do you come up with ideas? Well, Thomas Edison had a methodology. Firestone, Henry Ford. We went through, he had a whole raft of examples of people, and we talked about various approaches of how you come up with ideas. But the most educational part of it was, at the end, the last class, he said, maybe we should have a final exam. So we didn't fight him on that. Okay, we didn't quite know what we could be tested on. Well, then he taught me anyway, the most important lesson. He gave us a piece of paper and it said rice in Burma. Now, we had never mentioned rice and we'd never talked about Burma. And what do you do with that? So he had a grin on his face. He said, I don't know. He said, it's open book. And the lesson was, the question is more important than the answer. coming up with the question is the most important thing.
That's how you control or how you can generate creativity, and that's what Larry does in his studio. I mean, he uses these lessons to generate creativity and to solve problems and come up with designs that are really quite special.
That's what we did writing this book, because that was all just a lot of back and forth.
Yes. Yeah, that's for sure. I mean, we actually approached the book as you would approach an architectural project by, laying out what we wanted to accomplish and figuring out different options that we might examine, and then coming up with, with the best, hopefully, which was the best one. Now, back to the book, we propose, Larry, I should say, proposes 6 tenets to modern architecture, and those 6 are system, process, spirit, performance, beauty, and permanence. Now, you don't have to remember those right now because we're going to come back to them, but we think of those, Larry thinks of those, as core principles that apply to any architecture at any time, and especially now. The tenets are important, and they were developed over time. They didn't, come out of thin air. They are really a function of his the full arc of his career. But maybe you could talk a little bit about those tenets and how you came up with them and how you arrived at, the tenet of system, for example. That's
in some ways these are chronologically developed, and at the very beginning, not having a lot of experience designing buildings and working with people to come up with the designs, I was intrigued with the idea of system. And this was during the time when DNA was discovered, and we began to understand that our bodies are made out of various systems that are quite precise and quite definitive and repetitive, and that's how trees grow and plants and various animals. It's all very systematic.
one of the interesting episodes in his career was that he was a sculptor early on before his architectural career really took off. And he was a member of a group called The Five, and they were really very distinguished and critically acclaimed young artists at the time. One of them was Vera Clement, who recently died, and she became a very famous painter. But Larry was a sculptor, and up on the screen is one of his sculptures, which I thought was very interesting, wherein he is bringing order to complexity. And in a way, that is what he does in his architecture. I mean, when you're designing something, you've got all sorts of elements. You've got bedrooms and kitchens and classrooms and loading docks. And it turns out to be very complicated, but if you take it as an architectural exercise, you bring order to that complexity. And that's really what's going on in Larry's, I think, what's going on in his architecture and has, well, from the very beginning.
So one of the sculptures is on the left side, and it was very much influenced by Mondrian, but very quite different than Mondrian in that his was more artistically composed. This is systematically composed. There are various systems that interlock with each other and run back and forth. And so there'd be a series of boxes all made out of the similar components, but each was a different kind of artistic expression.
It's really the relationship between complexity and simplicity. What comes out of it is something that is simple enough to take in a single glance. Now, that manifested itself in an early project, which was for the ARCO, Atlantic Richfield, I guess. They needed a new style service station, and Larry worked on that. And this is a really interesting project because this was done in the 60s, and it looks as modern as it could be for now, really.
Yeah, the idea was, and we didn't quite get it right completely, But we did a number of things that have stuck in the industry. Gas was selling for 20 cents a gallon or something like that. So their modus operandi, what their business was, we have to sell a lot of gasoline in order to make the business work. So we had to figure out a way that cars could drive in and the gasoline could be sold as fast as possible, and then they could drive out without any kind of accidents, of course. And so it was a team that we spent about 3 weeks just sitting around talking about elements of a gas station. What's in a gas station? What should it do? And we came up with the idea that some of the ideas that stuck, you can see the pumps were the biggest thing in the state. I mean, they were quite big. They were 13 feet tall. And they were tall because when you drive into a gas station, what are you looking for? Looking for the pump. And the hoses, at the time, the hoses were coming out of pumps about 3-4 feet high on an island, and the hoses would be laying around the island in a very dangerous kind of arrangement for people to trip over. So that part stuck. And then the canopies, of course, there were canopies before, but this canopy was made out of triangular components, which would allow it, you can see the drawings on the left there, you could allow different configurations out of, again, the same components. They could be straight, and they could be triangular, and they could meet the conditions of various sites. So there was some flexibility.
The configuration of the design had to do with being on a corner, being constructible in a simple way, all sorts of needs, all sorts of demands that were placed on the design by the client were served by, well, the architect and engineers and other people who were involved in the project.
And what we didn't get right, which is we had an attendant right in the center, so he could get, because at this time there were attendants and they pumped the gas. So now there are no attendants. We pump our own gas. And the gas stations have a little store that you can go into, and that way they can begin to make more money for the operation.
And this was truly without style. I mean, this was designed from the ground up without any reference to a style of any kind. This was a project that did sort of cleave to a style. This was kind of a Mondrian-esque project, although Mondrian never imagined anything that he would paint or design in the North Woods of Washington. But how did this one come about, Larry?
This was a family in Chicago. They owned some land out in Vashon Island near Seattle, and they wanted to build on this slope. So rather than disturb the slope, we perched this construction on the slope. So the only foundation were a few pylons that went into the ground that stabilized it, and the building perched on the ground.
Kemper Hall, this is an unbuilt project which was designed for Kenosha, I think it was a private girls' school. I don't know if it still exists. I think it doesn't. But this is a very interesting project in terms of system. I mean, finding the system and repeating the system in various permutations and coming up with a really interesting design from very simple elements.
This was on Lake Michigan, and you can see the 3 dormitory units were on the lake, facing out upward in this drawing. And then the school elements, the classrooms, were on the left-hand larger part. On the right hand was the gymnasium and some of the larger classrooms. And then the triangular at the far left was the chapel. It was an Episcopalian school. And the chapel was a triangular that looked out onto the lake through a big glass wall. And I think the school never really got the finances for this vision. And it may have been because it was a little bit off tradition. So at that time I said, it may be that we have to temper this system idea with another idea. And what would that idea be? And that was where the idea of process entered into the...
Right. Well, process came to Larry a little bit later, early in his career, and I think it came from the question that he had to ask: how do we find the system? How do we arrive at a system that's going to work? And then once we find that system, how do we execute it? The process. I mean, it's a simple matter of taking one step and second step, third step, and ultimately reaching the finish line.
Well, and how do you get the client engaged and able to explain what they want and what they need and how you can work with them? And the process has developed over time to a point now where we do 3 solutions in the very beginning, in the concept phase, and then we bring that down to 2 with discussions with the client. They like one, they like this part of one, they don't like this part, they like that. And we begin to understand what it is that they need, and they begin to understand what they need, and then you boil it down at the last phase of design to one complete, which we like to think of as the best solution.
The House of Light, which is on the screen now, is one of Larry's signature projects from his early to mid-career, I would say. And I think it was really a real case study in process and how you get the client involved in the early discussions and develop a set of goals, and little by little put the pieces together to meet all of the requirements that you've established for the commission.
This client was a very special client. Diane Lipton had been an art history major and was very familiar with Renaissance buildings and the whole theory of Renaissance architecture. So she wanted a building that was filled with light and was artistic, and we had an agreement about Palladio being the model of this approach, and it worked out very well. It was filled with light. It had a skylight in the middle that came down into a dining room, which separated the living room from the kitchen, and then there was a library in the front on the second floor with a master bedroom, and then 3 bedrooms on the upper level. So it was a standard 3-bedroom, 4-bedroom house in the city on a lot that was 20 feet wide. So it obviously had to be vertical.
Palladio was extremely interested in light and borrowed light from the exterior, which is moving in and illuminating the interior. Those are very important ideas to modern architects. But here Larry was able to refer to Palladio, in the 16th century. I mean, it's just, and this was this was a very popular house. It got a lot of press, and I think it got so much press because it had these historical notes that people liked. People were very comfortable with the facade, the facade that fit very nicely on an historic Chicago street. But it had a lot of modern stuff going on too, like the open atrium. it was a very important house, and I think, well, his career was already going great guns by then, but this took it, I think, to the next level.
So then the same process was used with this factory. I mean, the reason for a standard process is every commission is different. So there should be no repetition in the results, which would be stylistic, but there is a repetition and a learning curve on how you get there. And this same thing ended up in an odd configuration for a factory, in that the loading dock was right next to the front door. And the way the building worked out, that's the way it had to be.
As I recall, the clients, who were the owners of this Republic Window and Door Company, had very democratic impulses. They wanted their workers to be really well treated, and they didn't want strict divisions between management and labor. I mean, they wanted the place to be different from the way factories were then typically built.
Yeah.
The fact that they ended up in jail, that was another matter. but they had very good impulses, and that was really the advent of this design, which is on Goose Island in Chicago, and really a very strong building. This also speaks to the fact that Larry's career has been very diverse. I mean, most architects, concentrate on, high-rises in the city, or houses in the suburbs, or industrial buildings, wherever they build industrial buildings. But Larry has done all of them, and he's used the same principles in, factories and high-rises. We'll see some high-rises later, and the houses. It's really quite remarkable. I mean, it seems remarkable from the outside, but when you understand what's going on and his process, it makes a lot of sense.
And you can see how inside we tried to make it as light and airy and as human as possible.
And the staircase serves both management and labor. I mean, the people who work in the factory in the back are using the same staircase as the people who are moving into the offices and managing the business. Okay, this is an interesting one. The McLean Museum of Asian Art, which is in Mattawa. This really had the process was classic Boothian process in this case. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about Barry McLean and how you...
Well, Barry McLean owned a machine company that started to do business in China 35 years ago. And he started collecting Chinese art, and he had a warehouse full of it, all in boxes. And he wanted to put it in this building. So I asked him, I said, well, what are the top 10 pieces that you have? And he said, I wasn't sure. So we went over to the warehouse. We started opening boxes. And we didn't get through many of them. But I did realize that he had big things, and he had little things, and he had medium-sized things. So we did a kind of a plan where we had a big gallery, and we had 2 small galleries connecting to a medium gallery. So it was kind of a Chinesey plan with a Midwest vernacular construction. And inside, the structure, you can see, was exposed with a skylight down the center, and it worked very well because, as it turned out, when all the boxes were opened, he had big things, and they went in the big gallery, and little things, and they went in the little galleries, and then the medium-sized things had a place.
But what he wanted was something that wasn't too Chinese. He wanted something that was comfortable on a Midwestern prairie. So the massing of this building the floor plan is Chinese, but the massing of the building is very much like a Midwestern pole barn, and I think that's what really appealed to the client in this case. Although the columns along this breezeway are Asian for sure. Okay, now the next tenet that we have is spirit, and one of the things that Larry found was missing in most modern buildings when he was a young architect was something that he called spirit, which are feelings, and feelings are ineffable, but they're absolutely real in architecture. And he found that spirit in architecture resides in memory, in the architecture of the past that is commonly familiar to many people. And this realization prompted his increased attention to historical architecture and incorporating elements of historical architecture into what are truly modern buildings. So that's
So the first one here, I think people may be familiar with.
Shore Acres. Looks traditional, looks historic, but it has a lot of modernity to it as well.
We were fortunate to be selected when the old clubhouse that had been designed by David Adler burned down, and I think I got the commission because I told the board or the committee that this was a building that was not an institutional building. It was a home. It was a residential building that was always a home, and it had been designed for a membership of 60 families. Well, now it has a 200-some membership, and so they did not want it to be replicated. But they loved the old building. They loved the informality of it, the intimacy of it, just how the people felt about it. So what we did was we worked on the plan to make it more functional and more flowing, and so spaces could flow one into the other, which is a very modern approach. And when it opened up, people walked in and thought it was exactly the old building. Mm-hmm. And it was because the spirit of the building was the same. So,
and the spirit was transmitted by details, by molding,
and the materials, and some of just the approach of the materials. And the next project was a similar one. Old St. Patrick's Church is on the west side of Chicago. It's just east of the expressway on Adams Street. And it's the oldest public building in Chicago. It was built in 1855. And at that time, it was an Irish community, and therefore that was Old St. Patrick's Church. But over the years, the neighborhood changed, and the whole environment around it changed. So when Jack Wall became the pastor, he was faced with 4 parishioners. There were 4 parishioners that would come to Mass. And so my wife and I started going to Mass there because you could always get a seat, even if you were late. And so over the years, we watched the church grow, and when Jack took it over, it was really Italian on the inside. It had several grottos, and it was painted in bright colors of blue and bright greens, and it was very Italian. So when the church got up to about 5,000 members, there was enough money to talk about some redecorating, and the church was, being that old, needed rebuilding in various areas. So what we ended up coming about was, again, keep the spirit. The spirit is the Celtic spirit, which was present in the windows. The stained glass windows had been done in the early 20s by a fellow named O'Shaughnessy, and he did beautiful stained glass windows with the Celtic motifs. So we decided that the project would be a completion of the Celtic design.
The Celtic Revival, which was a style at the time.
So we redid the altar in a cast plaster. You can see the holy water on the lower right-hand corner. We made that into an Irish well. So when you walk in Ireland, the towns, there's a well in the center, and there's kind of a tradition where you walk around the well as you come into town. And then we used the computer to build the light fixtures and the benches. The pews were curved so that they really became like a family gathering, that you could see the other people around you. With straight pews, you can't see them.
And this was not a restoration job at all. This was most of the designs and most of the iconography was designed by Larry and people in his office, based on the spirit.
Yeah, the Book of Kells is an illuminated manuscript.
Based on the Book of Kells, yeah, based on the spirit of the Book of Kells. This is a house which I like a lot. It's in Wheaton. It's on the Chicago Golf Club course. Well, Larry, why don't you tell us about how that came about and how you even gave it when someone needed to know what style it was, you told them, well, okay, it has a style. It's Scottish Renaissance. Okay.
It was a family of I think there were 4 children and like 12 grandchildren. They all lived around Wheaton. And the grandparents wanted to build a house that they could have the family over and have entertain large events from there. But at the same time, they were going to live there as a twosome. So it had to be comfortable for 2 people, and it had to hold 100 people with some kind of parties. So we broke it up into sections, and we had a sloped roof, as you can see, that sloped down, gave the interior a lot of space, but at the same time, by sloping it down to the edge, it brought it into a more intimate experience. So it was intimate with big spaces. And that was the goal, and we identified that as a goal, and the process delivered this.
And it was inspired somewhat by the clubhouse at Chicago Golf Club, which is was a turn-of-the-century arts and crafts clubhouse, very simple but really characteristic of that time. And Larry was able to, use some of the elements from it, but at the same time, meet the requirements of the commission. It should be obvious, but sometimes it's not, that any work of architecture has lots of standards of performance. And it was Larry's commitment that every project that he completes perform in every way that's called for by the client, by the site, and even by society. And to achieve that, Larry started talking about something called total performance architecture. To assure that he met all goals involved in any commission, he developed something that he called compass points, which were fundamental ideas that everyone on the team, everyone connected to the design, had to keep their eye on. One compass point was simplify for beauty. To achieve beauty, you want something simple. Complexity does not result in something beautiful. Simplicity does. And this we thought this was a good example of simplifying for beauty. This is on the north side of Chicago.
This is on Oak Street, right, 30 West Oak, just Oak and Dearborn. And it was an opportunity to analyze apartment living in a way that was a fresh way. so that there's two components to this tower. There were 2 apartments per floor for the most part, and the bedrooms were in a element that's on the left as you see it. Bedrooms have small windows because you want privacy and you want to be able to sleep in, and so that part of the building houses the bedrooms. And then the living space is all glass, floor-to-ceiling glass, all the way down, arcing across the view to the south, and then terminating with this outdoor porch at the ends, which wasn't not so much a balcony as an outdoor room. And it was an immediate. It is sold out immediately, and it's still very, very popular because it has this components of openness and living and privacy, deep privacy in the bedroom area.
And it has a simple and arguably beautiful profile.
Here, there's the plan on the lower right corner. You can see there's 2 apartments per floor, and it's made out of obviously concrete and glass. Oh, and then there are some townhouses we did in the back to sort of fill out the rest of the space. It was a slim building that didn't take the entire lot.
Another compass point is sweat the details. Details are very important. I mean, the massing is important, the simplicity of the full design is important, but the details are equally important. And this was a great project for Cook County, part of the circuit court. I think it was the family court. And there are a lot of details here which were very important and that might have been missed by architects who were less willing to really, fuss with, the small strokes. Yeah, that was the facade that you saw, the outside, created this inside, the spirit of the place had a sense of awe when you went in because the ceiling was like 5 stories high, and there were entrances on 3 sides, so that you could enter it and you didn't necessarily have to run into your opponent. And the awesome of the space calmed you down, supposedly, so that you wouldn't get too frazzled. But the way the light works in this atrium is it's striking, and it's not by chance. I mean, these are details that Larry and his staff really worked on, iteration after iteration after iteration to get it right. Another one of the compass points is that innovation echoes tradition. The idea is that nothing's really new in architecture, and many of the innovative ideas come from the past. This is a house in New Buffalo, Michigan, and it is it's really modern. It's really elegant, and it's put together as a number of fishermen's cottages, which is are part of the culture in that part of.
The family here was similar to the one in Wheaton. There was a need for a 1-bedroom house for the grandparents, and then the need for a 6-bedroom motel next to it. So they could come out when they were alone and feel really comfortable in the element on the left, and then on the element on the right is the 6-bedroom motel, and connecting them was this entry pavilion, this glass porch, which we put the dining room table in, and became a great place for family dinners. But it was built in a very familiar, vernacular, and sensible kind of way.
Which performed perfectly for the client and for the purpose of the house. Oh, here's another one.
Yeah,
It's a great looking house, just great, and it has lots of insets and which are intensively gardened.
Part of performance too is we live in a time where we have to do more with less, because there's more people and we've got this carbon problem, so we have to conserve energy, and there's a lot of performance that we have to bring to our architecture that is necessary. There's no question about it. We can't continue to consume energy the way we have been.
Another tenet of Larry's architecture is beauty. It's a simple idea, but it's deeply important as a standard of excellence. Beauty is something that everyone can see, can notice, but it's really very hard to achieve in architecture because there are so many things going on. There are so many needs that you have to.
Thomas Jefferson is always a good example of beautiful buildings at the University of Virginia.
And Larry has long been developing ideas about beauty by reading philosophers, Plato, St. Augustine, Louis Sullivan. And all of them tend to believe in absolutes that underlie beauty. Absolutes such as symmetry, that's Plato. Truth, that's St. Augustine. Democracy, that's Sullivan. Frank Lloyd Wright saw his architecture as a metaphor for nature, and that led to organic architecture, which really is one of the great signposts of the architecture of our time. And this is a house.
This is a house in Lincoln Park. The client came and said, "We want a beautiful house." So, and I think I've read enough to just boil it down to beauty is proportion. You have to have really harmonic proportions. You have to have shapes that fit together in a friendly way, in a beautiful way, and you have to have balance, so it can't be off balance, and so it's harmony, proportion, and balance as a absolute. So,
but one of the things that was going on here is this was Mohawk Street. It wasn't a working class neighborhood, but it was a pretty middle class neighborhood, earlier in the century, which of course in Lincoln Park has become something else. So the family bought 2 lots, but whether it was the family or the architect, didn't want to have something that was really too much. So what Larry found was something called Irish Georgian architecture, which is a very toned down version of Georgian architecture. Not the kind of thing that you would find in London, but the kind of thing that you would find in the countryside in Ireland, and much more modest. And I think he used the elements of that, I hate to say style, but of that architecture to guided this design. And it turns out to be it's a beautiful place. It's really luxurious, but it's not too much. It's very comfortable.
We also were inspired by the restraint of French chapels, small stone chapels that are sprinkled throughout France, with just beautiful proportions and very quiet environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, quiet is what characterizes this house. This is a great house. Larry's been doing a lot of work in Palm Springs lately. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about the Usher House.
Well, this is Palm Springs is the home of mid-century modern, but the mid-century modern was not interested in proportion. They were modern architects who were threw out all the rules of the past and tradition, and per proportion was one of them. So it's really functional architecture. So if you combine that with a sense of proportion and a rigor in the mathematics of the proportion, you end up with a house that has a little more beauty than many of the great, and they're great houses in the desert. But the desert provides a great environment for a very toned down, strict experience that makes you feel you're still in the desert.
Sort of an ascetic spirit to it, in a way.
So it's a very calm, peaceful, harmonic experience in the building.
This was a restoration an adaptive reuse that Larry did primarily in Gans Hall, which is in the lower right-hand corner of this panel. And this was a very interesting project.
The room was a little theater that when they built the auditorium, Sullivan was the architect, Adler was the engineer. And they were just about done with the project. It had been topped out, and the client came and said, I need a banquet room. And the only place they could put the banquet room was up in the roof. So they rejiggered the structure of the roof. And if you look at that, the pictures on the left, the lower right hand is a picture of the room as we found it in 1995 or so. And we had a picture of the room. As you can see there, a series of banquets, and you could see the light fixtures that had been removed at the time when we saw it, when we got to it. So we had to rebuild these ornamental light fixtures, which are ornament in the greatest way. That's what you say, wow. It is a wow. And if you have Louis Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright working together, it's not surprising that they did a wow. What is surprising is that people destroyed it. That's what was surprising.
Well, maybe not so surprising.
And hey, yeah, right. Well, you'd think you'd have a little more hope with humans, but
the fact is that there were no prototypes for these chandeliers. Larry and his staff had to work from photographs to old photographs, old black and white photographs, to redesign these.
So we found
these fixtures.
We found this small foundry in Wisconsin that were willing to take this on. The Roosevelt University is the client here. Ted Gaines was the president, and he had gotten $80,000 from a group of Swiss women who wanted to do a memorial for President Gans, who had been the president of Roosevelt, and he was Swiss. So we had $80,000. So we went to the foundry guys and said, okay, here's how much we have. We need 10 of these chandeliers, and they're made out of cast iron. Each one weighs about 600 pounds. And they were attached to the structure of the building, obviously, because they weighed so much. So they were really fun because they would do these wax molds. And we were trying to make it look like Louis Sullivan designed it. And so they'd come down with these several trips. They'd come down. The first trip is not even close. That's not Louis Sullivan. So they came, we showed them some more about Louis Sullivan, and we drew some Louis Sullivan for them. And then they came back, and it was getting closer. So I think there were about 3, 4, or 5 trips, and they finally got it, so we thought that they could do it. And we put them up, and then the painter came and gold leafed them and painted some colors on them. And you got, there's one of the great modern architects, Adolf Loos from Vienna, said at the early days of modernism, ornament is a crime.
Right.
Well, let's have more of that crime.
Yeah, yeah. The last tenet that we have is permanence, and I suppose permanence is somewhat relative. I mean, everything, even the Roman Forum is someday going to disappear, but it is a function. Permanence is a function of the materials that you use and the construction that you execute, and the functionality that is the result. And perhaps most importantly, permanence is achieved when the building, the project, blends seamlessly with its environment. Therefore, sustainability is an element of that. This is Larry's own, Larry and Pat's own studio, which was he claims that it was a chicken coop. I'm not sure it was that, but it was an agricultural building of some sort. And now it's just well, I don't know if we have other pictures of it, but it's a great, just a wonderful, wonderful place.
But also what's here is the prairie restoration that Pat has been involved with for 25 years or so.
Yes, well, that's another element of permanence. I mean, gardens are, in a way, in a sublime, maybe not in an absolute way, but in a sublime way, in a permanent elements of architecture, and that's what's going on here. This is very much a part of the prairie. In fact, the prairie is the star of the architecture, and the building itself is somewhat secondary. So
now I want to take us back to 1969 or 70, when this was the first building I did, and I was really nervous because I didn't want any problems. It would not be a good idea to have problems when you come out of the box. And so this is a building in Hyde Park. It was in the backyard of one of the large houses on 47th Street. 48th, it's on 48th Street. And it's brick and stone, and if you drive by today, it looks exactly the same as it did when it was built. There's been no weathering, there's been no problems at all. The windows are set back, and so the wood is protected, and there's large pieces of glass, so it's very simple. And the use of materials that are not going to deteriorate in any way.
But it blends with its environment, which is the environment, the architectural environment is Georgian houses and older turn of the last century houses. But the materiality and the proportions are very similar, and in that way, it is a really comfortable part of the neighborhood. Palmolive, Larry did the.
Yeah, we took the Palmolive building, which had been the Palmolive office building in the beginning, and became the Playboy building for a while. And as an office building, Draper and Kramer hired us to turn it into a residence. And the one thing that we did to make it work as a residence was, with an office, the windowsills were up 3 feet high, so you could put a desk up against the window wall. Well, that becomes off-putting as a resident. So instead of lowering the ceiling to put the mechanical systems in, we raised the floor so that the residential, they became like window seats. and it became very comfortable as apartments.
So what was once a classic office tower became a really comfortable residential building.
But the permanence of that building is an inspiration, because it's from it's almost 100 years old.
29, I believe.
And it's still a great building and will always be a great building.
This is a new building in the Gold Coast, of course.
This is on Bank Street, which is just off in Lakeshore Drive. So again, Draper and Kramer was the client, and they had owned this property for a long time, and the neighborhood had sued them to prevent a high-rise. After all the high-rises along Lakeshore Drive had been completed, there was one lonely lot that the neighbors glommed onto as a cause, and they went all the way to the Supreme Court, and Draper and Kramer lost. They had to build an 8-story building. And so we were fortunate to get that job, and learning from the Palmolive and maybe learning a little bit from Benjamin Marshall about how to make great apartments, we created you can see a big bay window that would create an interior that was opening the apartment to the lake views.
But it was designed to fit in with in a neighborhood of basically Art Deco
So
high-rises.
it's limestone and glass
Yeah.
and metal windows.
This is the last project we have. It's in Beverly Shores, right on the lake in the dunes. There's a permanence to this that I love, because it is so much a part of the dune, of the windswept environment that Larry found.
The only material that's exposed is glass, a little bit of metal, and concrete. So this building will be. You might have to put a new roof on about every 30 years. So this is butt glass. The outside of this building, the glass is glass to glass.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So the glass is not held in a metal frame. It's just butted up against another piece of glass.
Simplicity. Going back to simplicity. Well, that's it. I had one last question for you. And if any, please, I hope someone will ask a question as well. But you've had a really long career. I mean, most people don't have careers as long as yours has been. What kinds of lessons have you gleaned from being involved in modern architecture for the last 50, 60 years?
Well,
I mean, is that a question that you can
well,
get
I think
your
the
arms
answer
around?
to the question was the book that you have written so beautifully.
Oh, well, thank you.
That it's easy to read, and I think the words are appropriately and proportionately worked out, that they run together harmoniously, and it's pretty much like a building.
You know, you've seen architecture turn so many corners, and you've stayed pretty much on your own trajectory, and I think that's really admirable. I don't know if there's a question in there, but I'm wondering if you can reflect on that.
Well, it goes back to that class I took at Stanford, and sitting through all that seminar, and then realizing that there are right ways to do things and clumsy ways to do things, and you want to make sure you do it on the right way.
Mm-hmm. And it requires patience, patience and iteration and sweating the details.
Yeah, sweating the details. Yeah, question.
Okay, good.
Is there anything special about the glass in any way from an environmental standpoint?
The glass industry in the last 50 years has made huge advances. When you think that the insulated glass was invented in 1939, and it was very unusual at that time. And then after World War II, you began to see it so that the insulated glass is something that is you can use in a way that is appropriate, and you're not going to suffer like the early skyscrapers in Chicago when they built them were rattling double-hung windows in the winter, and they froze. Then in the summer, they sweated. So it didn't last long. The glass skyscraper of 1888, the Reliance building, did not get repeated.
Is there any architects in particular in the course of history that you look up to or have modeled any of your work after?
Well, the Italian Renaissance has really always been a keystone, and then there's a Alvar Aalto and the Swedish architects are very inspirational.
I can't recall the name of the house, but did you use cedar shingles on that one house? Maybe Lake Bluff. It looked like cedar shingles.
Maybe it was New Buffalo.
Yeah.
Oh, and the facade, yeah, that was New Buffalo, I think.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. You can use shingles on the facade, but as a roof, it's not the greatest because it only lasts 20 years.
The regularity of the shingle and the pattern on a
Right.
big facade. I'm familiar with the shingles. So thank you. Just curious. You didn't mention that.
Wondered how the world of architecture looks at your ideas and your process now in light of your rocky start at Stanford.
Do you get that?
Yeah, I think I'm pretty reasonably accepted.
Pretty solid now.
Great diversity in it.
Larry's book and Jay's book is on sale. Thank you so much for coming. It's so interesting. Thank you.